Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jay Laurendeau from the Department of Sociology at the University of Lethbridge. I'm also an affiliate of the Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education here, and I'm joined this morning by Numa Surmawala.
Hi, everyone. I'm an undergraduate student, just in my 5th year. I'm doing a Bachelor of Arts degree in General Social Sciences.
Numa and I are joining you this morning from the University of Lethbridge, located on the lands of the Siksika peoples, past, present, and future. And this is the kind of land acknowledgement that we often hear, but in this case it's particularly relevant because what we're doing is really tethered to the very question that animates a land acknowledgement like this. We're really talking about settler colonialism. So that really, in terms of my scholarship, in terms of my teaching, is my main area of interest, particularly where settler colonialism and sport intersect. Sport and recreation as sites of indigenous resurgence, refusal, and reterritorialization. So this particular presentation is part of a broader constellation of efforts maybe to provide resources to support faculty members who might want to bring analyses of settler colonialism into the classroom, particularly but not exclusively in kinesiology classes. And so this one specifically, we're trying to support folks who might want to bring the question of Palestine and Israel into the classroom. While there's a growing understanding of settler colonialism on lands claimed by Canada, the US and New Zealand, Aotearoa, and Australia, more work is needed in understanding other settler states like Norway and Israel, for example. Settler colonialism takes different shapes in different particular contexts, and so it's not that it's one thing, it's really a constellation of institutions, practices, and logics. And so it's important to look at the particular specific ones at work in these different contexts. Israel is also a particularly important site of analysis in light of current events. The ongoing genocide in particular that has been live streamed to all of us, especially since October 7th, 2023. At the outset, I think it's really important to name the distinction, or a really important distinction, between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The critique here is not for a moment of Jewish people or Jewishness, but of a settler colonial apparatus. It's a very similar critique, in fact, to the one that I would render of the Canadian settler state. And so we're focusing in on Israel in terms of its historical specificities, but the broader analysis is one that we could make in any settler colonial context. So in this particular presentation, and this is where Numa and I have the conversation that we've been having, the aim is to offer students a few things, and for this recording to help support instructors as they might want to bring these analyses into their own classroom. So first, a general introduction to the connections between sport, recreation, and settler colonialism, with a particular focus on the modern Olympic movement. Second, an introduction to Israel as a settler colonial project. And third, an interrogation of the claims of neutrality on the part of the IOC and other major sporting organizations. Numa, as someone who's taken courses with me and sat in on this particular presentation about Israel, the IOC, and so-called political neutrality, I wonder if you could share your perspective as a student. What kinds of entry points resonated with you as you've engaged with these questions, issues, and analyses?
Thank you for asking, Jay. That's a wonderful question. I think that as students, we're often inclined to think about sport and recreation through the lens of our own lived experiences, which can be productive if we position ourselves to learn about the broader mechanisms intertwined with sport and recreation. However, I think, from my observation at least, I've noticed that our perspectives, and while I can't speak for every student, I can speak for myself, that our perspectives might be limited to the individual level or even the community level based on our previous engagement or involvement with certain sports or recreational activities. And this is particularly why I think that the concept of settler colonialism really offered a valuable entry point for me. It allowed me to zoom out and uncover the deeply embedded layers beneath the surface of sport and recreation. And this was a crucial process of learning certain things and unlearning certain things, and really assessing my worldviews and biases in the process, which I think is important for us students, especially who didn't learn about the history of the lands we now call Canada in elementary or high school. My prior knowledge around the topic of colonialism has been very historicized and lacking care and nuance and crucial contextualization, which we need to understand settler colonialism as an ongoing process and locate it in the present. And my prior knowledge about sport and recreation has also been very romanticized, focusing on the success stories and or achievements of white hegemonic males or some iteration or mix of this. I haven't learned about the structural forces that contribute to these dominant narratives, or at least I didn't until I learned about settler colonialism through classes like this.
Can I pick up on that question about narratives?
Yes.
I think that's one of the things that in the classes that you and I have been in together that we keep coming back to, right, is the particular stories that are being told and how they're being told. And so whether we're talking about hockey in the Canadian context or, whatever, perhaps the story of lacrosse that we've also talked about at length in class. Can you talk a little bit about how that, how that's helped you reflect on the stories that are being told in and through activities like that?
Yes, for sure. I think that this really brings me back to the concept of belonging. We're often told the stories and voices of people who are naturally belonging to these lands because of their whiteness. What I have learned about colonialism has been very historicized, but it's interesting because in that history, I haven't learned about the stories and the contributions of Indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities in sports like lacrosse, for example. And that was a huge process of learning and unlearning who really dominates these spaces, who these spaces are for, and hearing their voices and stories, which are often concealed or hidden from curriculums, has deepened my knowledge, but also complicated it to extend beyond just the dominant narratives we hear.
I mean, lacrosse is a really good example, right? We've talked about lacrosse in class at some length because you've got this activity that Indigenous peoples and nations engaged in for, since time immemorial, essentially, that meant all of these things. It's used as dispute resolution. It's a spiritual practice. It's about relationality between nations. It's all kinds of things. And as Canada is taking shape as a nation and laying claim to lands through that process, lacrosse gets taken up in really troubling but also really telling ways. So I'm glossing over a long history, of course, but you see settler colonial actors. I'm thinking in particular of Beers, a Montreal dentist, right, who comes in, reshapes the game, essentially, like claims it as a Canadian game, reshapes it to make it more quote unquote civilized. And then over the course of decades, we see the game be codified in this very particular way in this process of so-called civilization, proliferates out into international competition. And literally, there are ways in which Indigenous peoples are prevented from playing the game that is theirs in the first instance. At the very same time as the Canadian nation state uses lacrosse to tell a particular story about Canada. So we have this international lacrosse tour, with this game between a so-called civilized team and the quote-unquote savages that is telling a very particular story about Canada as it's laying claim to space in the international arena. So much of this for me, it's why I caught on to your point about storytelling. So much of this for me is about which stories get told and in what ways. And I love that you said both unlearning and learning, because that's certainly the process for me. And what I emphasize in the classroom is there are histories that we don't know about, as you said, histories that are silenced, that we need to learn about. And we also need to be able to think critically about the stories that we already think we know and what else is bubbling beneath the surface of those. What gives us an entry point into thinking about Palestine and Israel specifically. And so in that, in this presentation, one of the stories that I'm really trying to trouble is this story of political neutrality that the IOC loves to trump out. The International Olympic Committee, in its history, in its modern history, has repeatedly trotted out this idea that sport and politics are separate. And that shows up not just in the IOC, but much more generally when you see commentators saying, shut up and dribble, like you're not supposed to be talking about politics right now, like your job is to entertain us or whatever. Is that something that you can talk about in terms of encounters in the classroom?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a privilege to say that you're exempt from politics or that something is apolitical or politics is really something to ignore. Everything is political. However, it's also cultural and it's also social. And this whole idea of neutrality is just a form of complicity. I think it's really easy for organizations like the IOC to claim neutrality in the name of politics and putting a certain image out. However, it's unavoidable. It's so deeply intertwined with political, structural, and cultural and social forces. And understanding that is important for locating Palestinian struggles to the present, because just as Canada has a deep history of Indigenous peoples and settler colonialism, so does Palestine and Israel. Israel is a settler state that parallels the same dynamics and forces as Canada, really perpetuating those genocidal violences. And when organizations like the IOC are silent about that, claiming neutrality, it just goes back to the idea of, well, whose stories are we hearing? And those stories, the stories of Palestinian peoples, and in sport and recreation, it's a great way to silence that and to silence what's happening in the world right now and has been happening since the 1900s for Palestine. So I think that's how.
Yeah, and for me, it's always, that process of asking questions about the dominant stories. It doesn't take much digging to find like where that falls apart, right? Because like the IOC under the exact same president took about, if I recall correctly, took 4 days to sanction Russia after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and was very explicit about like, here's us standing up for Olympic values. But then when it comes to Palestine, right, we see that just, I say the latest phase of a genocide, because the genocidal project in Israel is a much longer one over the course of about 150 years. But in the wake of October 7th and that particular juggernaut, I suppose, of genocide, we see the IOC once again claiming political neutrality when like less than 2 years earlier it was like, no, here's us taking a political stand. But when it's a political stand against Russia, it's a completely different beast than when it's a political stand against Israel, for a whole constellation of reasons. And maybe that's the other point that I would want to bring to the surface, and that I'm curious about whether and how that resonates for you in the classroom, is that when we're talking about, our focus here is on Israel, but this is not just about Israel. This is tied to not simply other states. I mean, it's certainly tied to imperial powers like the US, like the UK, like France, but it's also tied to global racial capitalism. It connects us to a whole range of things. It's not just about the settler colonial project on those particular lands. For me, it's about the tendrils and what it is that connects that particular political project to the settler project here on lands claimed by Canada in the US, to racial capitalism. So I wonder if that's something that you could speak to.
I think it always goes back to the idea of land for the purpose of what? Land being the common tether, and this always connects to themes that Jay just mentioned, including ideas of racial capitalism, capital accumulation, nation building, and belonging. All of these are central themes that are connected to all of the settler states, which we have been discussing. And that's really important to remember, because nothing operates independently. I think it's very easy to live in blissful ignorance almost and perceive, institutions and arenas like sport and recreation solely as a physical outlet for individuals, but it's way more than that. It's connected to these structural forces, and Jay calls settler colonialism a structuring structure, because that's what it is. It structures all of these institutions we have named for a few of them, including sport and recreation, and it manifests in different ways. And in the Olympic movement, it manifests very specifically, which is something that really requires deep interrogation. Yeah.
Something that you said there took me to, I know I've shared this with you in different classrooms at different moments, but took me to Lisa Slater's notion. I think the quote goes something like, ignorance is an activity. It isn't simply not knowing, it's a form of knowing supported by the socio-political system, which for me is exactly that point about unlearning right now, that you made earlier rather, right? That we need to recognize the ways in which what we know and what we don't know is shaped by the context in which we've grown up. So for me, as a white settler on lands claimed by Canada, I have learned very particular histories, and I have not learned others in the context of my formal schooling, let's say. And instead of seeing that as somehow a mistake or somebody not teaching me something that they should have taught me, it's been really important and generative for me to understand, oh, that's actually part of the idea. Like for the Settler Colonial Project, which I appreciate that you named earlier as an ongoing one, for it to continue to lay claim to those lands and resources and all that comes with the colonial project means that the populace needs to buy into it. And so that's the sense in which this is a structuring structure, is not only does it shape institutions, that are about material gains or about about a whole range of things, but it shapes educational institutions in terms of what we're taught and not taught. We can think of all kinds of conversations about the Alberta curriculum for example, right now, where we've had politicians saying, oh, that age, let's say it's age 6, that's too young to learn about residential schools. Well, it wasn't too young for Indigenous kids to be torn from their families and taken to residential schools. But the very move to try and say, well, we've got to be careful what we teach kids and whether and how we teach them those histories is part of how settler colonialism is in operation in the present.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's where I really struggle to understand our educational institutions. I mean, we devoted an entire year in high school to learning about nationalism and an entire year to learning about globalization and the historical events that contribute to these processes, but we only briefly touched on the residential school system along the way. And there was this whole piece of history completely exempt from what we were taught that is so connected to nationalism and the nation-building project of Canada. And the idea of buying into it, which you mentioned, brings an important idea for me, which we've discussed previously in class, is the idea of intention, whether it's intentional or not to conceal certain stories or, have certain topics hidden from curriculums may or may not be intentional. However, the effects of it are still very prominent. And it takes me back to also that spiderweb metaphor, that we're all spiders working in different ways, building different webs to the overall web that is settler colonialism, when we may not even realize that we're working and helping to build the web. I mean, I didn't realize that until I hit university. So it's really important to assess your own ideas, your own worldviews, and how what you've been taught throughout your life has shaped that, and really try to break it down and reconstruct it to account for all of those things which we're missing, which we haven't learned, which are so important to Indigenous peoples for their resistance, to acknowledge them and to materialize their histories and really support them in their reterritorialization and in their resurgence.
Mm. And I love that you named a minute ago, you said something that took me back to the question of worldviews. Oh, intentionality. I love that you named intentionality, because I think we sometimes get caught up in wanting to figure out who's doing the evil thing, when part of what this analysis calls for, as far as I'm concerned, is exactly what you just named. Let's think about how that's being shaped by and aligns with a particular worldview. It doesn't mean that necessarily that somebody is sitting there going how do we keep Indigenous peoples down? How do we keep attacking them? That's not necessarily in some instances, that's exactly the conversation. But in most instances, I think it's a logic that's at work, right? It's a logic like, of course, this is Canada. Of course, we need to of course, we have authority to govern. Of course, we have authority to make decisions about resource extraction projects or about the shape that funding for Indigenous sport should take, for example. And whether, like, whatever the intention of the person who's thinking or saying that, the effect, as you just named, is what's vital. Right? And in some cases, there's a real benevolence, like the very notion that you hear embedded in so many things, like we should do the following things to help Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities, is itself a colonial position, right? Because the thing that we should do, principally, is get out of the way and find out what Indigenous peoples and communities and nations need and want and figure out how to support that instead of a colonial body or a colonial institution making that distinction.
The last thing we want is to embrace the white savior complex.
Yeah, that's right, but which is well embedded in the colonial project for sure.
Absolutely.
So can we turn our attention back to Israel and Palestine for just a moment? And I think what might be helpful to tease out for the folks who might be listening and watching is what it is about this analysis that can help us, that can help us think about what's unfolding on lands claimed by lands claimed by Israel right now. So for you, as we've touched on in a couple of different classroom spaces, how has that, what have you found helpful in engaging with the topic of Israel and Palestine?
I think, again, and I keep mentioning this, everything comes back to settler colonialism, and it's a very important thread, and maybe framework is a better idea to understand Israel and its actions, because everything Israel does is for a very specific purpose. It's for a very specific purpose of occupation, and what Patrick Wolf calls the logic of elimination is how can we get rid of not only Palestinian bodies, but their identities. And their identities are very, very much so intimately tied to the land, just like it is for Indigenous peoples, not to speak for every Indigenous person out there, but just speaking more holistically. Settler colonialism has been a very important piece of the puzzle for me to understand, and for me to understand the history of Palestine and its occupation, because I think there's a common misconception that the genocidal project that's currently happening is only current, which is not true. It's been happening since the 1900s, and understanding Israel's occupation of Palestine, it exemplifies those logics of settler colonialism that we have learned about, and land being the most valuable and desirable thing to claim, and also understanding relationality. I'm just gonna rewind back for a second. What do you think sport and recreation, where does sport and recreation really come in relation to Israel and Palestine?
To me, it's what you said earlier, and it's what we've both said. If settler colonialism, if we understand through this analytic that settler colonialism is not just a concrete thing, and certainly not an event, but a constellation of institutions and practices and logics, then we need to look at all of those. And sport, for me, is one really important lens, maybe, through which to look at that, because in part because it's such a vital space of culture, right? As you've talked about earlier, it's one of those spaces where we see culture at work and ideas being produced and contested. And so for me, sport is always a point of entry in that way, not least because it's often dismissed, as we were hinting earlier, as just entertainment. Well, we shouldn't be looking at politics there, like that's just a sideshow, essentially. But because it's understood as a sideshow, I think that's a really interesting place to look at what else sneaks in the door when we're talking about sport and recreation. So whether we're talking about something like the International Olympic Committee or FIFA being petitioned to sanction Israel, for example, or whether we're talking about the particular kinds of physical cultural activities at work, whether it's football or soccer in the context of Israel and Palestine, or whether it's parkour in Gaza, as you and I have talked about in another space recently, to look at it as a space where these ideas are contested, where settler colonial logics proliferate and are reproduced, and settler colonial violence unfolds, and also to look at it as look at sport and recreation as spaces where Indigenous strength and refusal is evident, as in the example of parkour, right? So you've got parkour in Gaza in this instance, where you've got these athletes who are just refusing that logic of elimination that you just named, which is so important, right? The genocidal logic is so central to the settler colonial project. And so anything that refuses that, anything that constitutes a, we are here, this is who we are, and this is where we find meaning, is a refusal of that logic. And so something like parkour in Gaza, where you see athletes literally taking rubble that has been produced by that genocidal project and instead turning it into a playground, turning it into a space where they can reclaim this, like, this is our space to do these things and be who we are and celebrate who we are. That is a refusal of those colonial logics as well. And I love that you named relationality, because that's one of the things that I so often find myself articulating, because the temptation, even when we do start talking about settler colonialism, which often takes some convincing to even have that conversation in the first place, the temptation often is to think that settler colonialism is something that shapes the lives of Indigenous peoples. But the point that you're making with relationality, and certainly that I would make, is that in a settler colonial context, we are all entangled in those webs that you just talked about, right? And so those webs produce my sense of belonging in Canada, for example, as a Canadian, because settler colonialism is shaping all of those institutions that touch my life. And so certainly settler colonialism shapes and constrains the lives of Indigenous peoples, but we're all entangled with it if we live in occupied territories, again, whether here or in what is commonly known as Israel. Maybe the other piece that your comment made me think about, one of the ways in which I'm seeing an analysis of settler colonialism in Israel refused right now is people saying, that's not a settler colonial project, that's a national project, or that's a different thing than Canada, because those are lands that Jewish people have historical ties to. And I think both of those things are true. Do Jewish people have historical ties to those lands? Absolutely. Is there a national project, and one that comes from a really important place, like a national project to create a space of safety for Jewish people who have experienced so much discrimination and so much anti-Semitism that is for literally millennia? Both of those things can be true, and it can be a settler colonial project. So I'm thinking of Rashid Khalidi, who has talked about and written really compellingly that we need to understand Israel as both of those things, as both a national project and a settler colonial one. So that national project to create a Jewish homeland, let's say, that could take multiple shapes. So I'm not, and the folks that I'm engaging with who are writing about this aren't contesting the connection of Jewish people to those lands. It's about how that's being put into practice. It's about the genocidal logic and the genocidal practices and genocidal institutions and practices that by which that's unfolding, right? That national project can take multiple shapes, but as it happens right now, and since the late 19th century, it's been formed into one that is inescapably genocidal. And you mentioned that earlier, and it's actually quite explicit in the writing of early Zionists. Like, for us to have these homelands, for this to be a Jewish homeland, the language was, we need the Arab population, I think that might have even been called the non-Jewish population, right, in this kind of erasure of complexity, to be spirited away, I think was the language. Like, we need them gone. For us to have the kind of homeland that we want, we need them gone. And that's just the most obvious, maybe, example of that genocidal logic. And as you said earlier, that might mean the literal killing of people, but it also sometimes takes the shape of, like, we just need them somewhere else. And it also takes the shape of assimilation, of them being gone as Indigenous people, as Palestinians in this instance. And so again, to make the connection to lands claimed by Canada, it's not that the Canadian settler colonial project needs all Indigenous peoples to die, literally. It's that their connections to territory need to be fundamentally severed, right? For Canada to continue to lay claim to those lands, or to go to the other part of the world right now, for Israel to continue to lay claim to different parts of lands that were historically Palestine, it needs to sever those ties between Indigenous peoples and those lands. So that can take multiple shapes, but they're all part of that logic of elimination that you just named.
Yeah, and the idea of two truths existing at the same time is something that's very relevant here, because as much as settler states like Israel and like Canada might try to sever those ties to the land, there are avenues, such as through sport and recreation, where Indigenous peoples and Palestinian peoples can assert their identity. They can embody resistance and resurgence and reterritorialization, while literally, for example, in the case of Israel, is completely constructing massive destruction. And that brings me back to parkour in Gaza. What a powerful and bold way to embody resistance is to... The movements of parkour are very risky, but they're also...
Can I offer something
Yes.
that might take you back there? So one of the things that you were just saying that really twigged for me is, the very idea of movement, because one of the central elements of the colonial project is what Moss Norman and other colleagues call a logic of containment. Right, so we need to keep Indigenous peoples in these spaces. We might be talking about a reserve in the Canadian context, or we might be talking about Gaza, which is effectively an open-air prison. But in any case, it's about controlling and constraining the movements of Indigenous peoples. And so I wonder if that's what you were going for, right? Anything that is about, like, no, we are free to move in these ways, in these spaces, is such a fundamental refusal of that logic of containment.
Yes, that's exactly what I was trying to articulate.
I think from my perspective, I think we've hit on some of the important threads. Is there anything else that's coming to mind for you right now?
There is a point I wanted to say, if that's okay.
Please, of course.
The spaces created by sport and recreation, where Indigenous peoples and Palestinian peoples embody their freedom, is a call to the world. And it's a call to the world to recognize these spaces not only as sites of decay and loss that they have been because of Israel, also as a source from which they persevere to carve out their freedom, which is really, really powerful, especially as a racialized person, seeing that.
What a beautiful note to end on. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Jay.